Welcome to the Best is Surrey podcast. My name is Paul Deach.
And I'm Marisa Heath.
Great. Now, we're joined today by Xavier Brice from Sustrans. And anyone who knows me knows I'm a keen cyclist and active travel advocate. So I'm pretty excited to have Xavier on the podcast today. Just introduce yourself, Xavier, and what it is that you do.
Sure, Paul. It's really great to be here, and hi, Marissa. So, as you said, I'm chief exec of a charity called Sustrans. We're a UK-wide charity, been around for almost 50 years. We make it easy for people to walk, wheel, and cycling. So, like you said, we're about active travel, as it's now called, which that's a very technical term, isn't it? But basically, we make it easy for people to walk, wheel, and cycle. We work with government, communities, critically, range of organisations across the UK. And we are custodians of the National Cycle Network, and Route 4 goes through here in Runnymede. So the National Cycle Network, little blue signs with a red number on them typically, created almost 30 years ago by Sustrans. We don't own it all, but we bring people together to make it happen. So I live in Runnymede, so I am a Surrey resident, been here for, gosh, about 20 years. I grew up actually in Kent. And so yeah, I'm here, if you like, as both a Surrey resident of Runnymede here in Village of Englefield Green, and a CEO of Sustrans.
Great. Now, what I'm going to do is just to sort of frame the conversation a little bit and just to get us off to a good start. I just want to tell you about my own personal journey with cycling, right? Because I think that would be a good sort of case in point. And it essentially started that when I joined Surrey County Council, I belonged to a committee which was responsible to determine all things like cycle infrastructure, public transportation, all that sort of stuff. And I attended lots of meetings, and all I kept hearing was excuses about the barriers to cycling, okay, and why people don't do it rather than the reason why people do it, kind of thing. And there was a lot of I don't know what the word is, but a lot of misconceptions about cycling and cyclists.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, the only way that I'm going to really understand this is if I give up my car and try it myself. And that's exactly what I did. And I stood up in a full council meeting nearly 3 years ago. It'll be 3 years in May. Nearly 3 years ago, and stood up and said, right, I'm going to send my car back to the lease company. I've got an e-bike on order, which will be delivered in January, and I'm gonna have a go at this for a year-long trial. Now, nearly 3 years later, I'm still doing it because I love it so much. It's one of the best decisions I ever made in my life, actually. But one thing I have discovered quite a lot is that people hate cyclists. Yeah, I think it's fair to say. And I just want to start the conversation along those lines, because recently this year I went to Holland to try their cycle infrastructure, and I really did see how the other half live from a cycling infrastructure point of view. So much so, in fact, that I came away from Holland on my first trip. I went twice this year. On my first trip, pretty depressed, actually, thinking, God, we're never going to have this here in the UK, or certainly not in Surrey. So let's have that as the conversation starter, and tell me what your views are.
There's a lot there, Paul, isn't there? Wow, that is a great story. And 1 year turns into 3, and I'm not surprised, which we can come back to. But that's not necessarily for everyone either, which we can come back to. And that's not necessarily what it's about. It's not a kind of car bad, bike good, far from. And I own a car, use a car, as well as a bike. So what I'd like to what really struck me, what you said about the myths, if you like, and the misperception. So before I was at Sustrans, I worked at Transport for London for 10 years. Right. One of the first things I did there was work on a new walking and cycling strategy for London. This was before cycle hire, before cycle superhighways. They were actually the recommendations from the work I did. So it's great to see them implemented. But when I started that work, there was sort of similar misperceptions from including people at TfL and other people who I met as part of that work. So a typical thing was, yeah, that's all fine for Holland, but it rains here in London. Okay, it does, but fact, it rains more in Amsterdam.
Rains in London. Rains in Holland. What?
Here are the stats. Okay,
Yeah.
okay, but London's hilly, Holland's flat. Yeah, okay, that is also true. Freiburg in Germany has hills and has very high cycling levels, and some of the highest cycling levels in the UK at the time, and still is Bristol, which is one of the hilliest cities. So a lot of these things, they might inform people's choices on what to do. Like, I don't like cycling in the rain, don't know about you, but it rarely rains when I cycle to the station. They're not reasons, they're not structural reasons why we can't do it here. And my favourite one, yeah, given where London is now, I think it's probably acknowledged that London has the best cycling infrastructure in the UK right now. Yeah. It didn't. And when I was doing this project back in sort of the early 2000s, 2007, people would say, yeah, it's all very well talking about Amsterdam and Copenhagen, but this is London and we can't do that here. And then you can go in and talk about road patterns or whatever it is. Yeah. And actually, it's proven not to be the case because cycling has exploded, certainly in central and inner London. And the reason it's done that is a whole host of reasons, but not least it's because there has been money, effort, time put into making that happen. And let's remember, Amsterdam in the 1970s was car dominated. Amsterdam was not a cycling paradise, nor was Copenhagen. This is something that has taken decades to achieve. And in fact, England rather, used to have cycling levels to rival Northern Europe, Holland and Germany back in the 1930s, 40s and 50s. Yeah. So this is about choices society makes. And that's a really important point, as well as choices individuals make. And going back to that anecdote about, yeah, but this is London. When I started at Sustrans, I soon realised, having worked either internationally or in London, that going around the country and talking about what's happening in London isn't a great thing to do. Doesn't tend to win you friends, understandably, because everywhere's different. But therefore, it was no surprise that you talk about what's going on in Manchester and the potential for Manchester, and people would say that that's all fine, and I know what's happened in London, but this is Manchester, not London. We can't do it here. And now you look at what's happened in Manchester through the leadership of Chris Boardman when he was there, and now Sarah Storey. And again, it's proving that you can change places, you can change habits. And fundamentally, what we're talking about, whether it's on a societal level or whether it's, Paul, your individual decision, yeah, it's about change. And change, we know, is really hard. And it's really hard to imagine that things can be different. But here in Englefield Green, where I am now, there used to be 3 department stores, a butcher, a fishmonger's, 2 hardware stores. I could go on. This was a very different place just 110 years ago. Places change, habits change. I don't believe our cities and towns are going to be car dominated in 50 years' time. It's going to look different, but it is hard to imagine that. Just as it's hard to imagine what's happened in London over the past 20 years, if you rewind 20 years.
So just thinking about that, because obviously, I mean, the reason we're both very interested in this is not only is Paul a cyclist, I'm also leading the net zero agenda
Yeah.
at the county council and trying to get the 2030 and the 2050 goals. And one of the biggest, there's 2 huge obstacles. One is changing energy in people's homes, but the second is transport. It's huge.
Yeah.
But the numbers seem to show, and you know, you and I know it very well in Englefield Green, more and more cars are coming. So every household now has 2, 3, sometimes even 4 cars. What are we going to do about that? Do you see that trend changing then? Have you seen any data that shows that people are thinking about having less cars? I know, for example, I've read something that young people aren't going to taking their driving tests as early as
Yeah.
they used to, and sometimes not at all. Is that an indication of change then?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Marissa. So a lot of the indicators are going the wrong way, not just anecdotally in terms of what you see, like the number of cars parked outside a house, but also if you look at what happened to transport post-COVID, public transport, especially rail, but public transport in general, is still not recovered. Yeah, and there are different reasons for that. But what recovered really quickly and then exceeded pre-COVID levels was car travel. Yeah. So and we also know that the overall car ownership is at its highest level on UK roads. Yeah.
Right.
But I think there's another view which the data also supports, Marissa, but it's about the trends and what's happening in the future, which is the idea that the 3 of us here, we represent peak car. Yeah. My guess is we're roughly the same generation. Yeah. Sort of midlife-ish. And actually we're part of the bulge that's going through society where actually, you know, we grew up with cars. It was a rite of passage to get your driving license. Everyone did it. Yeah. Age 17, as soon as you could, if you could afford it, of course. But typically you could just about afford to insure your car if you were from a middle class background, at least, and the rest. And a car was still aspirational, etc., etc. And it's just normal to drive, yeah? But the younger generation are not learning to drive at the same rate, like you said, Marisa, and no one really knows why. So is it because insurance costs are so high? Is it because it's so difficult post-COVID to get driving tests? Is it actually because they'd rather be on public transport on social media rather than actually driving? Is it because small cars have got so expensive? Is it because they're more eco-conscious? You know, you could list all the different reasons, and there could be lots of research and it'll tell you different things, but there is something happening.
Mm.
I would not use the example of my eldest daughter, who's not fussed about getting her driving license because she's the daughter of the CEO of Sustrans and she likes to ride a bike. Yeah, so that's probably a bad example. But I think the data shows that is the case out there. But that is a slow process, of course, that's going to take time. And in the meantime, yeah, there's more traffic. And I suppose back to what's the problem is. The problem isn't cars per se. Yeah, you can't uninvent cars. Cars can be hugely useful. Yeah, I've got a car. The issue we face is, if you like it, it's kind of it's one of traffic and choice. Yeah, and it's kind of it's a sort of it's a vicious cycle where we talk about car dependency. And what's meant by that is, in order to be a functioning member of society, yeah, fully functioning, you need access to a car. Otherwise, you're really going to struggle. So if I want to go to Ashton and St Peter's Hospital, yeah, which isn't that far away, it's a few miles, and I want to go by public transport, good luck. Yeah. It will take me 3-4 times as long as it would by car, and I'll be able to go there 4 times a day, which isn't any good because I've got to get there 3 hours before the appointment. Yeah. So I have no choice but to take a car, whether that's to pay for a taxi or to have my own car. That is car dependency in a nutshell. Yeah. And of course, if I was poorer, it would be a much bigger problem. Yeah. In terms of that. So that's car dependency. And then because everyone's got to have a car, you end up with more traffic, because the logical thing to do is to drive.
Yeah.
So this isn't about castigating people for the choices they're making. These are often people feel they have no choice and don't have a choice. But when you do feel you've got a choice and when you can do something different, Paul, it's no surprise you decided to stick with it.
No, but it's interesting because it's often polarized between being sort of a left agenda, isn't it? Cycling
Yeah.
and things, this whole sort of thing. But actually, to me, you've mentioned a few things. Congestion, well, that's an economic issue. You're stopping businesses going, you're stopping your local economy churning, you're stopping money getting basically into the country. So, you know, it doesn't just sit on the left. Things like air quality, that's something that affects everyone. The more cars you've got on our roads idling with engines going in traffic and things like that, the worse it is for our children and our own health. That's again something we should all be really concerned about. And you mentioned the key word choice. I think at the end of the day, choice is the most important thing here. It's not about saying to people, you must get on a bike or you're a bad person. It's about sort of saying you can get on a bike if you like. It's safe to, and it's fun, and you know, it's accessible. Or you can walk, or you can get a train, or you can get a bus, or you can get your car. And I think that's what we should all be striving for, to offer all of that rather than just the one option you've outlined, which is to get in the car.
Completely. I guess to get sort of political about it, I suppose where it rubs politically, with a small p in terms of left or right sometimes, is that individual choice often just assumes that everyone's got equal choice. Yeah. But I think what we're talking about here, which is often something that is more on the left of sort of conversation, is that actually choice is determined by what you have available to you. Yeah. In this case, if you don't have a cycle lane and the shared pavement down your key route to the station is about half a metre wide, which is patently unsafe, people are probably going to choose not to cycle there. Yeah. So there are structural issues causing people not to cycle. You take that to the extreme, it starts to become a very left-wing argument. You take the individual choice thing the other way, it starts to become a very right-wing argument. Yeah. I think what we can agree on is that this is not should not be a political issue. It should not.
Yeah.
This is fundamentally about our ability to choose to do something that is good for us, good for a whole host of reasons. But actually simply saying we need to encourage people to cycle, and it always winds me up when this comes out as a policy statement from a government, we need to encourage or promote cycling. It's a bit like, well, yeah, you could talk about promoting driving and there not be any roads. Yeah, you've got to have the basics in order to actually promote it and to do it. And in order to make that choice. And it is absolutely about choice. And not every journey can or should be cycled. Not every journey can or should be driven. But I think but it would be a nicer world and a nicer place to live if we didn't have to drive everywhere, if we could walk more, if we could choose to get around in ways like that. It would be nicer. But you see what happens when it gets warped and twisted, and things like the idea of, wouldn't it be nice to be able to walk to the shops, to walk to the doctor's surgery, rather than have to get in a car and travel a long way get painted as a Marxist hellscape prison, when in actual fact all that is the concept of a 15-minute neighbourhood. Yeah.
You mentioned the P word, and you said that we shouldn't make it political.
Yeah.
The problem is it's politicians that make these decisions, and Marisa and I have a very recent example in Surrey and Guildford of a scheme that looks like it's going to fail or has failed because politicians have got involved. And at the end of the day, they're answerable to their electorate. Now, I don't blame the politicians that made that voted the way that I would have preferred them not to vote. I don't blame them for that. They listen to their residents, they listen to what people are telling them. Mr. and I and other members of the cabinet at Surrey County Council who made this decision were heavily lobbied from both sides of the argument. I mean, we literally received hundreds, if not thousands, of emails from both sides of the argument. I think it was probably pretty evenly split as well, I would say. Without adding it up, it looked pretty even to me. But how do we get round that? And have you got any examples of? So you mentioned London, you mentioned Manchester. Not recently, but last year went to Cambridge, where they also have fantastic cycle infrastructure. It's clearly working in those places. But do you have any examples of smaller, let's say not mega cities, but counties like Surrey, where it's been a success, and how did they do it?
Great question, Paul. It's a great question. I have a smaller scale example. It is London, but it's out of London. But I think it illustrates the point I want to make on this.
Right.
Which I think, so if asked on what is the most important thing to create change in this area, I've said consistently for the last sort of 15, 20 years, it's not about money, actually. The most important thing is political leadership. Because we're in a democracy, it's political leadership. And there's a really interesting relationship between the role of a politician to lead and then representing the electorate versus leading the electorate. It's difficult. But in a democracy, you're never going to have everyone agree. So part of the role of the politician is to actually lead. That's why we call them leaders, why we elect leaders. So I think we're agreed that political leaders have a leadership role, which isn't doing what everybody thinks should be done, or the loudest voices should be doing what done. That is the most important thing. Talked about London. You've had 3 very different mayors in Sadiq Khan, Boris Johnson, Ken Livingstone. All 3 arguably different politics. Ken Sadiq, quite different Labour politicians, a Conservative politician, but all of whom have been consistent in terms of political leadership on this issue for very different reasons. So this is not about politics in terms of party politics. This is about living in a democracy. I think that by the way, political leadership first. Second thing is actually having good ideas and being able to do stuff. And then the third is the money. There's no point having the money if you're not going to spend it well. So let's talk about somewhere where this has worked. And which required political courage. Waltham Forest in outer London, northeast London. What we would now call a livable neighbourhood. It wasn't called that at the time. That was when that was put in. That was an area in outer London dominated by rat running, by traffic in streets near schools. There was a mini high street with a lot of boarded up shops that had traffic going down it. And what happened was a scheme was put in to restrict cars. They couldn't cut through these roads. And it attracted a lot of controversy. There was opposition in particular from one retailer in particular, who didn't like the idea that they wouldn't be able to be parking right outside the shop for everyone all the time. To cut a long story short, it got put in. It took a lot of political courage from the local council leader, who followed it through. And when people were surveyed at the time on whether they thought it was a good idea, half of people thought it was a good idea, half of people thought it was a bad idea. Or I think it was a quarter thought it was a bad idea, a quarter weren't too sure. And broadly speaking, by the way, that's what we see on these sorts of schemes. Half of people think it's a good idea, quarter of people think it's a bad idea, quarter of people are undecided. And there's lots of research on that across the country. When they were surveyed a few years later, 97% of people wanted to keep it, 3% of people wanted to take this out. And this is it, yeah, it's change. So going back to this idea that it's change, and the job of political leaders is, I think, in part to take us through that change, yeah? And so to say, this is what we must do. And I think the job of the other job of the political leader is not to go back to what we were saying earlier, like polarize the debate. Cyclists are the enemy, the cars are evil. And I can happy to, you know, there are examples of that happening that are just really unhelpful. Yeah, really, really unhelpful because it's lazy stereotyping, it's cheap shots, and whether it's deliberate or not, what it does is it undermines change and it just further polarizes us. And polarization was what Merriam-Webster's word of the year, I think. So this is clearly, you know, around in the world, we need less polarization, not more. And, you know, cyclists, back to how you started, people hate cyclists, easy target for that and not what we want.
Is it the issue, Paul, just to step in, between those cyclists like Paul who are going somewhere and the cyclists who everyone sees as the Lycra crew who come out at the weekend and take up the road? Is that one of the issues here? Because there does seem a kind of sort of view of, okay, you're a cyclist going to work, we might just sort of deal with that. You're going somewhere and you're sort of doing something useful, and oh, you're just sort of meandering on our roads at the weekend, causing me pain because I can't get to Waitrose or whatever it is. And is there any sort of thinking in your mind as to how the rules, or how you kind of create, I don't know, I don't know if there is already a cycling code of conduct and all of that kind of thing. I've got no clue. Is there any thoughts around that sort of thing, just to try and create harmony between maybe the hobby cyclists and the motorists and things, to try and get rid of that tension?
It's a good question, Marissa. So I've cycled from as long as I can remember as a little kid. So I've seen, when I first moved to Surrey, I went and I ride Lycra too at the weekend. I don't post about it on LinkedIn or Twitter, but I do. But I also cycle in a suit, yeah, and cycle in normal clothes and all weather down to the station. And it's a really good question and a rich one. There's a lot in there. So let's talk about Surrey in particular, yeah. So when I first moved to Surrey 20 years ago, I would go to Box Hill on a Saturday morning and I might see 3 other people cycling. Yeah. Box Hill is now world famous. You go to Box Hill, you know, it is just full of cyclists at all time of the year, let alone the summer, out from London, everywhere. Yeah. So I think there is something about, if you live around by Box Hill, that is a pain. Yeah. That clearly is a pain. Yeah. That is really not pleasant. In the same way, if you live near Newlands Corner, you're going to have loads of sports cars and stuff most weekends, yeah, because and motorbikes. So I think there's an issue of kind of what that experience is like in Surrey, or for people who live on those routes that are heavily frequented by people in Lycra. I think the other thing is people's behaviour. So cycling code of conduct, there's a highway code though, and actually the highway code is interesting because it's now been clarified that cyclists can ride 2 abreast. But that's not been very well communicated. And previously it was a bit ambiguous. Cyclists should ride no more than 2 abreast when conditions allow. Now it's much clearer. And so, but there's not been an advertising campaign around that, so people might not know, but you can ride 2 abreast. And actually, sometimes, you know, if people are riding 2 abreast, that means you've actually got to overtake properly, but you should be overtaking properly anyway and pulling out into the other lane rather than trying to squeeze past. Having said that, you know, there are occasions where I see people who are frankly behaving without any consideration for other road users as people on bikes. Yeah. So they're riding 3 abreast, or they're riding 2 abreast, just dawdling along really widely apart when actually traffic's struggling to get through because of the nature of the road. And that's just people, isn't it? I mean, in the same way, you know, I'm sure we can all think of inconsiderate drivers. Yeah. So something here about recognizing that it's not about car driver bad, cyclist bad. It's that you've got people who behave badly on all forms of transport, frankly, and we just need to share the road and show common courtesy. So I think that there's sort of that point. But yeah, people often do equate cyclists with Lycra, and that's really unhelpful. So I was reading a piece in the newspaper last week where Surrey's own cycling and crime and police commissioner is quoted as saying that the last thing she would want to do is prioritise investment for cyclists because they ride 3 or 4 abreast in front of her and they don't pay road tax. Now, we need to prioritise investment in cycling in Surrey if we want children, if we want people to get around in a better way, a cheaper way, an easier way, a way that results in less need for road repair. And no, I don't pay road tax. Well, actually, I do pay road tax. I've got a car, but all cyclists pay council tax and income tax, which is what pays for our local roads. It's not road tax. Road tax pays for road rate. I mean, where to go with that? But and that's again an example of really poor political leadership. This person has a voice. That's how they're choosing to use it. And whether it's deliberately pandering to a particular audience or whether it's a firmly held belief, it's just one, it's wrong, factually wrong. Two, it's just a blatant stereotyping, and it's seeing cycling as this hobby thing, this lycra thing, rather than and just a bit of an activity, when it should be a choice about how we want to get around for children, for older people, for everyone.
I completely agree with that, but and I'm very disappointed to hear Lisa Townsend, the Police and Crime Commissioner for Surrey, talking in those terms. I'll be having words with her the next time I see her, that's for sure. But and I pay road tax.
Yeah.
We have a car still in the family, and I very rarely drive it. It's only to run my daughter around and stuff because she refuses to get on the back of my bike, and that's understandable. But I pay road tax, as you say, through our council tax. It's a misconception people paying road tax. They pay vehicle excise duty, not road tax.
They do.
Two completely different things, and we all pay council tax. So I pay it the same as everybody else does. But do you think, because this has been something that has been in the media recently, do you think it's time that cyclists are compelled to take out insurance for their bike and have their bikes registered? Now, I do have bike insurance, but I do dedicated bike insurance, but I do that voluntarily. There is no I'm not legally compelled to take out bike insurance. Do you think maybe the time has come and that might actually help ease that tension?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Paul. So would it ease the tension? My hypothesis, my guess, is that there'll just be another reason why to blame bloody cyclists, if you like, which is a phrase often used. So I don't think that it would ease the tension.
Right.
Number one, I really don't, because I don't think the issue is that. I think that's being used as an issue, going back to the fact that factually, as you just said, people who ride bikes do pay tax for the upkeep of the roads they ride on. So it's not true. And in the same way, if you started having to tax bikes, would it deal with the issue? Well, clearly not. But move on to something else. Is there an argument for that, for insuring bikes, for mandatory registration? Well, if you do the cost benefit, what is the cost of them not currently being insured to society or being registered? What's the real impact of that? So people might say, oh, it's the damage that bikes do to pedestrians. More people are killed by cows in the UK each year than are killed by pedestrians killed by cyclists. Fact. Right. So there's not much talk about the danger of cows to people. In fact, witness what happened not far from here in Ashford when a cow was being sort of manoeuvred by police and rammed, because that was the way of dealing with it as the investigation. Uproar. It's the complete opposite. So anyway, sidetrack. That's sort of what versus the cost of it. So and I'm not talking about the cost to individuals and it's like, this is something we want people to do, and I think everyone broadly agrees with that. Pretty much. There might be a few that absolutely not, but generally, successive governments have said this is something they want to see more of, with different caveats or different incentives. If you put barriers in the way of doing that, then it makes it less likely to happen. So in Australia, it's mandatory to wear a cycle helmet, and there was a dip in cycling levels afterwards because you're putting a barrier in the way of doing something. So why would you make it harder for people to do something that you want them to do for very little, I would argue, benefit?
Right, that's fair. You want to say something, Marisa?
Yeah, I just wanted to turn to a moment to planning. We spoke about this briefly. Obviously, there's a lot of nervousness. I think there was a headline today in one of the papers that Angela Rayner's intending to take a county the size of Surrey of Greenbelt and turn it into housing. We're very cognizant of the need for affordable housing, but nonetheless, there's a lot of nervousness about more housing coming into Surrey. We've already got really congested roads. There's some areas where you just have a nightmare getting to places because the roads weren't built for the level of cars on them. You know, we're going to see more development, there's no doubt about it, but it seems to me it's never sort of worked out very strategically. So to me, you'd be much better looking at the whole county and kind of saying, where can we actually put this infrastructure where it really works and connects to the 15-minute access to GP, hospital, shops, whatever it is, train station things, and start to build with more thought around how you sort of draw the networks together. But it's just making the point, I suppose, that if we're going to have more traffic, it's in every single person's interest that we try and control the car numbers. Sorry, not more traffic, more housing, that we try and control the car numbers, because otherwise every resident's just going to be stuck in congestion all the time.
Surrey will be gridlocked,
yeah,
wouldn't it?
So this is something that everyone should be worried about and interested in my view. Now, obviously, with planning, hopefully we will get developer contributions, and I guess it's thinking about how we use those sensibly. I presume that's something you work on at Sustrans, making sure that people are tying into this, because I've seen a lot of examples. At the moment, I'm leading a piece of work on reviewing the rights of way at Surrey. And I've had so many people email me sort of going, oh, well, I've got this excellent right of way that leads to wherever it leads to, but it hasn't been maintained, or it's not this, or it's not that. And we've had it, you know, for 10 years, I've been raising this. And I'm like, but you've had about 12 developments go on around you during that time. Why on earth didn't someone, the local authority, demand that money was put into improving that right of way, which would have given people an opportunity to get to the school or whatever by bike or walking? It just seems to be missed all the time. Like there seems to be some low-hanging fruit even that we're just missing. We're not very good at sort of the big picture. That was incredibly garbled, and I'm ill, so
No.
excuse me for that. But do you know what I'm saying? Like the overarching
Yeah.
planning still doesn't seem to be there on this. I guess the local walking and cycling infrastructure plans are trying to address that.
Yeah, there's a lot there, Marisa, and you're right. It's a really important area. So just to sort of state the obvious, but it's sort of, so talked earlier about, you know, there might be trips that you can't cycle. Yeah. Actually, there's a lot of trips in Surrey that are cyclable. So I remember when we first talked about doing this, Marissa, you said this is about, could Surrey be a great cycling place and walking place? Absolutely could. Yeah, we're quite densely populated. The sort of journeys people are making are quite short. So you've got to have the infrastructure there. But there are other journeys that maybe aren't possible. And this is often where new development is, the way it's typically been done in this country is that in recent years is that, you know, I remember passing some recently, probably in Berkshire, on when I was cycling out west, and you see it, and it's that sort of, you know, it's a big housing estate, no shops, nothing like that, on a roundabout with roads that then take you eventually into the nearest town. Yeah. And it's disconnected from anywhere else. And often road development, houses are justified by developing a motorway junction. The motorway junction is developed, it's justified because it's going to unlock housing. So there's a fundamental question around how do we want to live and what sort of places do we want? And if you design for the car, assuming everyone's going to have a car, then lo and behold, everyone has a car and the traffic goes up. Yeah. So planning is really important at the level of being able to plan the right journeys almost. Because typically we don't travel because we like to. I mean, there are a few exceptions, yeah, but who goes on a Sunday drive now? We travel because we want to get from somewhere to somewhere else. Yeah. And that should ideally be pleasant. And let's face it, who really likes traveling? It's not about saying people you can't travel, but given a choice, most people would rather travel a bit less, hence why working from home is so attractive, one reason. Yeah. So I think that getting that planning right, and we have done work at that at Sustrans and are doing more. So we did a report with a charity and an organisation called Create Streets, which took a development in I want to say in Chippenham, near Bath, which didn't go ahead. It was stopped because of, I think, part of the traffic impact, which was it was associated with a motorway junction. It was going to be a big expansion of the motorway junction. It's going to take a big pile of land outside of the city, and then build fairly low density housing. Yeah, so look, you know, big houses spaced out, sort of thing. Instead, so what would happen if you took half the land, which costs half the money, instead of putting the money into the motorway improvement junction, you put it into a new railway station and railway loop, and then you also have better walking and cycling networks connecting you into the town centre. Yeah, you can have the same development for less money, and a much nicer quality of life as a consequence, much lower carbon, all of that good stuff. So getting that right at kind of the master planning stage, being strategic, Marissa, what you're saying there is really important. And that means joining up transport. It means joining up how we think about land use. So in this country, if you want to build a development, you can one thing you can do with your developer contribution is promise to fund the bus service. Yeah. And you'll fund that bus service for a year. And guess what? The bus service might not go in until about 8 months after people have moved into their house. And then you run it for a year and nobody's using it. Well, no one's using the bus service. It's like, well, no, because it wasn't there when they started. So what are they going to do? They're going to get in the habit of driving. Whereas in Holland, you cannot build the development unless you put the bus route in first. The buses have got to be running before the houses are
accurate.
It's a no-brainer.
So and when you put it like that, when you explain it like that, it's a bit of a no-brainer because people are not stupid or want to do the wrong thing, yeah. But if there's no bus there, people aren't going to use it. So and so it's that thing about back to choice, yeah. So what do we need to do this? Well, in order to get people out their cars, if you like, there's got to be a viable alternative. So my daughter used to go to cadets in Windsor on a regular basis. She would take the bus there. She literally couldn't take the bus back because the buses stopped running at 9 o'clock and she came back at 9:30. And she did eventually actually start cycling back on an electric bike when she was old enough, felt safe enough to do it. But before then, I would go and get her in the car because it was the only thing to do.
Right. I'm very conscious of time, and I could talk to you for hours about this, Xavier. I think I've just got one other question before we wrap this up, and that is, I think that political members, certainly of Surrey County Council, and probably other councils as well in Surrey, would really benefit from either you or a member of your team coming and having this conversation and having that kind of leadership point you were made earlier, and debating it, all the pros and cons and all that sort of stuff, and start raising some awareness about the fact that in Surrey, a study was done, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, about the impact of congestion, the financial impact of congestion on Surrey, and apparently it costs us 500 million a year in lost productivity. It's probably more than that now, because that was 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah.
So I think we need to have this sensible conversation, because it's just the motor car and the way that the congestion of it's just not sustainable anymore.
No,
we're going to put in all this development that Marisa mentioned earlier. So would you be willing to come to Surrey?
Yeah, happily, Paul.
Talk to our members.
I would love to. And on that point about just traffic growth and traffic, even if you think climate change is a hoax, even if you don't care about air quality or you think electric vehicles are going to save us, let's just look at it at a point from congestion. Yeah, doesn't matter whether it's an electric car, a hydrogen car, or a car powered by fairy dust. Yep, it is a car in the road taking up space. And one argument could be, well, look, we could build our way out of this. Yeah, we could build more roads. The problem is you're taking away road space, giving it to cyclists, let's say. Yeah, that's one argument here a lot. Okay, fine. Let's just think about building more roads. There is no evidence that building more roads solves congestion. To put it crudely and simply, yeah, I'm sure most people, and mine is, wardrobe is too full. Yeah, if I got a bigger wardrobe, I bet you in a year's time my wardrobe would still be too full.
Mine definitely would.
Yeah,
basically, and it sounds like just a silly anecdote, but there's actually a scientific theory backing that up, around what happens when you create more space or make something more efficient.
You've got the proof on the M25. I mean, they put the extra lane on the M25 and it's made no difference whatsoever.
Exactly, you've got the proof on the M25. It's something called Jevons paradox, yeah. Who was one of the people, he was a coal economist, yeah? And people were saying that when the first steam engines were invented, that as they got more efficient, yeah, and cheaper, yeah, there would be less coal consumed, basically, yeah, because the engines would get much more efficient, which kind of makes sense, yeah? So your early steam engines were massively inefficient. So once you make them more efficient, you need less coal, yeah? What happened? Once they get more efficient, it's cheaper to do them, and therefore people got more coal because it was cheaper to make electricity because they were more efficient. And it's the same thing, you create a better road. Or self-driving cars, that's also another thing seen as the answer. Yeah, self-driving cars are going to be super efficient. They're going to be safer. They're going to be super efficient. They'll use road space better. Okay, let's assume all that's true. What are we going to do with the extra road space? We'll fill it up with more cars. Yeah.
Right.
I don't know about you, but I commute less than I used to. Do I use that time to spend it with my family, to go on contemplative walks? No, I just work more. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's life, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Well, look, Xavier, thank you so much for taking the time to come and chat with us on this podcast. It's absolutely fascinating. I will take you up on your agreement to come and have a chat to Surrey County Councillors, and let's have the debate.
That would be great.
That would be fantastic. I've got one final question for you. We normally have a segment on our podcast called Surrey Discovery, which we're not going to do tonight. But I just, from one cyclist to another, I want to know your favourite ride in Surrey.
Oh gosh, my favourite in Surrey.
Yeah.
In Surrey, gosh, because my favourite ride probably takes me out of Surrey.
Right.
So that is a great question. My favourite ride is probably to Newlands Corner from here.
I like
yeah,
that.
It probably is from Newlands Corner. Because I go up a road. And one reason is there's a lane. Is it Hungry Hill Lane? I think it's called.
Yeah.
What a great name for a road.
Yeah, great.
English road name.
Yeah.
And then the view from Newlands Corner is fantastic. So, and the view of London as you go up Coombe Hill, I think it is amazing. So that is all. But actually, the other ride that I really like, which is, a sort of a more thought through answer, because that's, if you like, a lycra ride, what people might expect. But actually, my favourite ride is the one that often I'm like, oh God, do I have to? So I live in Englefield Green, and for those that don't know, Englefield Green's at the top of quite a big hill. Yeah. It's like the first hill out of London after Richmond Hill. And I get the train in Egham, bottom of the hill, which is great. So in the morning, when I take the train somewhere, I ride down the hill. I can always know exactly how long it's going to take me. I basically don't need to pedal. On the way back, I've got to cycle uphill.
Yeah.
And, that's not a great thought, yeah, because it's not an electric bike. I've got to cycle up a hill. But by the time I get home, I always feel better for it. Like my head feels clearer and I feel better for having cycled up the hill, yeah. And that bit of effort, that I know it's doing me good, but that's not the point. I just feel better for it. And it's lots of people say that when you do, and let's go back to, why is this a good thing? Why are we so evangelical about it, like you are, Paul? It's because it makes us happy. It is actually a joyful thing to do. Like, even cycling up the hill at the end of a long day, I feel better for doing it.
Well, I'll recommend a ride to you. Do you have a gravel bike?
I don't know. I have
a mountain bike.
No, I don't. I'm firmly
road bike.
Yeah, but tell me.
I was going to say the Basingstoke Canal from one end to the other. It's a beautiful ride.
Yeah, it's also a nice place to walk along, isn't it?
Oh, it certainly is. Yeah.
So I was down by a few weeks in the summer walking along by Perford along the canal there.
Oh, yeah,
just beautiful, beautiful. Past the poet John Donne's house and stuff like that, ruined abbey. And again, Surrey's just full of beautiful walks, beautiful cycle rides, and they should be something that everyone can enjoy.
Well, Xavier, Brice, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Pleasure.
Hopefully we'll get you back again, but we'll certainly be having you at Surrey County Council to have the conversation with our councillors. So thank you very much.
Thank you.